Hello and welcome to our class version of Crash Course for the Merchant of Venice. This presentation is going to give you information about the relevant themes and the important characters from the Merchant of Venice, and it's also going to give you information about the difference between Shakespearean comedies and tragedies, because I'm guessing that up to this point, most of the experience that you've had with Shakespeare has probably been with one or more of his tragedies. Tragedies are usually defined as plays in which a hero who is of high estate, which means that they are of a prominent position within society, suffers some kind of downfall as a result of his own flaws, which he allows to consume him and to grow out of control. Ultimately, a tragedy usually ends with the death of this hero. As a result, tragic plays are extremely formulaic. When you walk into a tragedy, you know what to expect. You're looking for that central character, you're looking for that flaw, and you ultimately know that that character's jealousy or pride or inability to control his own emotions is what's going to lead to the downfall. For instance, Romeo and Juliet, which you all read freshman year, contains a tragic hero, Romeo, who allows his over-emotional nature to take control. He stops making rational decisions, and in the end, he ends up dying along with several other characters. When it comes to a Shakespearean tragedy, however, this set formulaic outlook does not really apply. If you were going to ask an English teacher what the difference is between a Shakespearean comedy and tragedy, they might give you an answer that's along the lines of what you see on this slide. A tragedy ends in death, and a comedy ends in marriage. And while this is a nice little compact definition, the differences between tragedy and comedy are a little bit more complex than that. First off, there's a difference right in the name. Comedies are usually much more lighthearted and even times much more funny than what you would find in a tragedy. There are other elements that you can expect to see in a Shakespearean comedy as well. First off, you're simply just going to see more emphasis on clever wordplay, puns, and insults than you would see in a tragedy. And you're also going to see more lighthearted scenes, which do not always push forward the central plot. So as we read, there will be times where we rush through a scene or two simply because the emphasis is more on the humor between the characters and less on the storyline itself. Comedies also tend to have plots that revolve around mistaken identity, particularly those that involve the characters being in disguise or even in some cases cross-dressing. And this was a nod to the fact that all of the actors who were portraying the characters in Shakespeare's play during his time were men. So in order to portray a female character, these male actors would have to cross-dress and become women. Shakespeare would then add an extra element to the play by having these male actors who are already cross-dressing as women portray characters who then cross-dress as men, adding a different element into it. If you've ever seen the movie She's the Man with Amanda Bynes, that movie is based on a Shakespearean comedy, Twelfth Night. And so Amanda's character, who cross-dresses as a man, would be an example of this type of play that we would have in a Shakespearean comedy. You'll oftentimes notice that there is going to be a clever servant or a fool who primarily exists to make fun of the people that he serves. There's also typically going to be struggles in which young lovers overcome problems, both personal and social. Women are going to be presented in greater depths than they are many times in the tragedies. And finally, yes, there is a lot of marriage that happens in the Shakespearean comedies as various characters pair up and end up getting married. The Merchant of Venice was written between 1596 and 1599, and like many of Shakespeare's plays, it appears to be the origin of phrases such as "all that glitters is not gold" and "love is blind" that had never previously been used in the English language. The name Jessica also appears to be something that Shakespeare made up, and he uses it as a name in this play. So if you know anyone named Jessica, this is where they can attribute their name to. The main action of the play takes place in two settings, Venice and a nearby village called Belmont. The Merchant of Venice from the title is Antonio, but an argument can be made that the main characters are actually Shylock, who is a moneylender who lives in Venice, and Portia, who is a beautiful member of a prominent family living in Belmont who is looking for a husband. Her father has set up a test which any man who wishes to marry her must pass. The play is complex and involves several different subplots and a lot of different themes, which it will be important for us to keep track of. But in particular, there are three areas which we are really going to concentrate on. The first is that we're going to look for differences between Venice and Belmont. Many of the characters move back and forth between these two settings, and so it will be important for us to see how the settings are juxtaposed with one another. Pay particular attention to what is valued in both cultures, what the characters talk about in both places, and how the characters' behavior changes when they go from one setting to the next. Another major idea that we will focus on is the idea of mercy and forgiveness. Be on the particular lookout for which characters grant mercy and which characters deny or withhold it. Finally, when you're reading The Merchant of Venice, it's unavoidable that ultimately we are going to need to talk about the subject of prejudice. We have to look at the characters' attitudes and the messages that Shakespeare conveys through the actions and the words of the characters. No discussion of The Merchant of Venice would be complete without acknowledging the elephant in the room. It is a heavy play, and it does contain some language and some attitudes which are extremely troubling, to a point where there have been many critics who have actually said that even though this falls more under the formula of a comedy because of the way that it's structured, that it's actually much more of a tragicomedy and not really a very funny play overall in many areas. The reasons for this criticism all center around the character of Shylock, who I mentioned previously is a moneylender. Shylock is a Jew, and he is primarily defined in terms of his Jewish identity throughout the play. He is the major antagonist, and he and Antonio are set up as being in opposition to one another. Some of the language that the characters use when referring to Shylock is very troubling. And so to put in a little bit of context what was happening during the time when this play was written, unfortunately, it would not have been uncommon to encounter anti-Semitic attitudes during the time that Shakespeare was writing. We are well aware of the fact that throughout history, Jewish people have suffered persecution time and time again from culture to culture, starting with the time when they were expelled from Egypt and had to form their own society, all the way up through the Holocaust, and unfortunately, even into the present day in many different countries throughout the world, including, unfortunately, our own. During Shakespeare's time, however, it would have been much more common to encounter openly hostile attitudes towards Jewish people. In some countries, Jewish people were required to live in ghettos or to wear clothing which readily identified them as Jewish. And as you know from history, this was a practice which continued up through the Holocaust. During the time when Shakespeare was writing, these anti-Semitic attitudes were starting to become more and more prominent, to a point where 50 years after Merchant is written, a leader comes into power in England, Oliver Cromwell, who makes a law which bans Jews from settling in England. The portrayal of Jewish people in literature from this time period is often stereotypical and unflattering, and the portrayal of Shylock certainly falls within this category. That being said, The Merchant of Venice is a play which has sparked an enormous amount of debate over the years. Some critics have suggested that The Merchant of Venice is proof that William Shakespeare himself was an anti-Semite. I don't know if that is necessarily true, but certainly the content of the play definitely suggests that he was well aware of the anti-Semitic attitudes of the time. There has also been significant debate over whether or not the portrayal of Shylock in the play is racist. For many years, Shylock was not portrayed as a sympathetic character. He was often played for laughs, and he was portrayed in a very unflattering light. However, over time, the actors who have played Shylock have begun to interpret his lines in slightly different ways, and people have begun to realize that perhaps the portrayal of Shylock is not meant to be racist, but is in fact meant to be a sympathetic portrayal, which is meant to make you question the attitudes of the time and perhaps show more sympathy for this character than many people would have been wont to do. As we read, I challenge you to look for evidence that supports both sides of this argument, because I think it's very fair to say that both sides have a very legitimate point. So now that you know a little bit about the play, it's time for you to choose your role. Everyone will be reading. Please keep in mind, however, that we will be reading some scenes outside of class, so it is possible that some roles that have a large amount of lines will be cut down a little bit when we're reading in class. There is a link on Plus Portals to Sign Up Genius, which ranks the characters in order of their importance and in general order of how many lines they have. Everyone must choose a part. If you do not choose a part, I will randomly assign you one. Please go to the link now and select your part, and we will begin reading tomorrow in class.